I'm going to do a quick video about rent deposit schemes, or sometimes they're called rent bond schemes, because although they are not, strictly speaking, part of the homeless application process, they are kind of an important and significant kind of part and parcel of what councils do. And if you understand why they exist and what they're there for, you can kind of understand how to best make use of them, because in some situations they are really good. What they mean is that for certain people, it is well worth them pursuing kind of help with the council, even if there's not going to be a main duty to them. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit. But basically, rent deposit schemes are partnerships between housing authorities and local, sort of local private landlords. And it's in theory, it's an arrangement which both parties profit from it. So in theory, private landlords, get a free estate agent out of it, basically. So in theory, private landlords get a series of relatively stable tenants who will then move in and they can kind of claim rent for, often through housing benefit, but not always, universal credit, whatever now. And the council gets additional housing options, basically, because obviously councils, without private rented sector, councils are restricted to social housing, which is obviously kind of very difficult to get into sometimes. So private rented accommodation gives the council additional options to support people into housing. But as I say, there's a few things that you might not realise about the way they work, which kind of help you kind of use them or kind of make the most use of them. So the first thing to say, and I've kind of already alluded to it, is that councils want to foster a good relationship with those private landlords, and the way they do that is they fill those tenancies fast when they become available, and they fill them with people who they believe are going to make good tenants. And obviously, it's impossible to tell for sure whether someone's going to be a good tenant, and who's going to pay the rent and not kind of commit antisocial behaviour or whatever. But that is what councils are trying to do. So councils essentially, as soon as a property is offered by a private landlord, the council will want to, as quickly as possible, put someone forward for that tenancy. And there is obviously going to be a bit of a time lag with that, but that's ultimately what they want to do, so that the private landlord is not out of pocket for any longer than they would need to be. So the landlord can kind of, as I say, foster that relationship. So the landlord will keep coming back with more and more properties. And if they put people forward for those properties who, don't end up being good tenants, then the landlords are unlikely to use the council in the future. So they're kind of juggling those kind of dynamics all at once. There's other kind of things that come into. I'm going to sort of scatter around here, but there's a few other things that come into it. So, for example, if you are a couple without children approaching a council, there might be a main homelessness duty to you. Obviously, for many single people, private rented accommodation is unaffordable. And obviously councils can't be assisting people into unaffordable accommodation because the person's homeless again or whatever. But basically for couples, because you've effectively got two incomes and you've only got one heating and one kind of set of utility bills to cover and so on, one TV license and so on, it becomes more affordable for couples to afford private rented accommodation than it is for single people. And for that reason, if you're a couple approaching a council, it is very likely, or certainly kind of not, it wouldn't be surprising if the council, instead of kind of pushing you through the main homelessness route, they would try and find private rented accommodation for you ASAP, because it just gets you off their list, basically. And in theory, should be a good outcome. So that's kind of just something to bear in mind. Where rent deposit schemes can be a little bit, they can kind of be part and parcel of a bit of a trick that councils play, is that you approach a council. It's often clear on day one to the council that there's going to be a main homelessness duty owed to you. But what they'll do is they'll say, look, we don't know if there's a duty to you or not yet because we haven't reached a decision. But there's this private rented accommodation over here, that's ready for you for tomorrow to sign up to. If you don't accept it, it might be there's no actual help that we're going to give you down the line. And so they kind of put people in a situation where it's kind of, a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. And so people are kind of pressured into accepting accommodation, which actually is not really what they would ideally want. And ultimately is kind of less ideal than social housing might be. Now, again, there's all kind of things that can happen. There's plenty of people who enjoy and kind of, get a good deal out of moving into private rented accommodation. But ultimately, because social housing is going to be cheaper rent, because it's going to be longer term tenancies, often, on paper at least, moving into social housing is probably going to be better for most people. So that's where rent deposit schemes can become problematic, because they're kind of these private offers are used to pressurize people when actually they're not really told the full facts. Because for many people, the council know from day one they are going to owe them a full duty. They can't issue that decision yet because that's the way the HRA works, but they know it. But they'll often, some of the sneaky ones will try and pressure people into accepting accommodation, which actually, given the full facts, they wouldn't accept. So yeah, that's something. I mean, but because if you understand that relationship, again, sorry, I really am scattering around here, because the way the relationship does work, local authorities want to fill those properties with good tenants as soon as they can. And what that means is that you may have someone who actually isn't going to be owed the main homelessness duty because, for example, they're not in priority need, but it's still well worth them approaching a council, making the homeless application, because if there is a private rented property available that day, it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. If there is one available, the council, will want to fill that with a suitable tenant as soon as possible. And it may be that, you are that person. So, you do often hear kind of situations where someone approaches the council, they might approach them day in, day out for ages, get knocked back, but all of a sudden they get housed very quickly because, the stars align and it kind of all works out for everyone to do that. So as I say, that's why, and again, it's another reason why, if you are homeless, you should be making homeless applications. It's that simple. There are very, very kind of obscure reasons not to. 99.9% of the time, you should be approaching the council for homelessness assistance, because even if there's not a main duty going to be owed to you, it's entirely possible that there will be other assistance people can provide. Now, again, just dropping a few of the things in that kind of may come under this umbrella. Councils do have lists of landlords they work with, excuse me, but they're not going to give you those lists of landlord names because they need them. There is that relationship with them. So, a lot of people will kind of, get miffed that the council hasn't given them the list of numbers. They're not going to give you that information because it's in their interest to have that relationship with the landlords rather than you. So, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else you'd want to know about private rent deposit scheme tenancies. Again, just a little bit in terms of what it actually is. Essentially, what happens is the council is not necessarily paying the deposit, but they're guaranteeing the deposit. So in theory, if you damage the property, the landlord will be able to claim against the council. And the other thing is to say is that often councils will not only guarantee the deposit, but they will pay the first month's rent in advance, potentially kind of any other sort of charges associated with it, because again, it's just understanding it's in their interest at that point to get that person housed. So there is probably more to say about this, but I'm probably going to leave it there. Again, if you find this stuff interesting, if you find it informative, please do like and subscribe it. If you've got any questions about rent deposit schemes, do put them in the comments. I will answer them. I'm not in a position to provide individual sort of support for you if you are homeless, unfortunately. That's just the way it is. I'm limited to Bedford Borough. But if you have got generic questions about the way rent deposit schemes work or the way the law works, I'm more than happy to try and answer them as best I can. So yeah, hopefully that was useful. Take care.